All right, well, let's dive in. So for those that don't know me, my name is Brian Hahn. I'm with MTradecraft, and I do intelligence contracting and provide cybersecurity consulting to a little over 200 SEC registered firms. So I operate as a brain trust to my client. It means I don't sell software, I don't sell vendor services, ongoing management services, that sort of thing. And so I always like to be upfront about that, because today I just want to have an open conversation about what I see in the industry and some of the conversations I'm having with my clients, with you guys knowing I don't sell these services on the back end. So, it's always a knowledge transfer in the webinar here. So we're going to discuss cyber incidences, containment, reporting, and we're going to explain why the police aren't your friends, contrary to what you might believe. So we'll talk about a few things that your IT firm is probably not discussing with you, and perhaps even your compliance attorney is not consulting with you. So what started all this, of course, if you've seen some of our other webinars or been in the news, is 20649. It's, I think, a little over 230 pages total of cybersecurity regulation that's going to be coming down to SEC registered firms. So there's a great little two-pager out there from the SEC that you see up on your firm. It's a great summary. Today we're going to be discussing the reporting of significant cybersecurity incidences. So the SEC is proposing the introduction of a new form, the Form ADV-C. So we'll discuss that. And then also just practically what to do in the event that you're attacked or you've detected some kind of malicious activity on your network. So let's start with just an overview of what we're talking about in terms of protection. What are our battlegrounds? And for most firms, that really comes down to two things. We're protecting data, whether that's our client's data or the firm's data, and we're protecting assets. The asset side is a lot bigger for some, is a lot bigger target for some clients, obviously. If I have a Bitcoin trading firm in South Korea, that's obviously a lot bigger threat than a small financial planner in South Carolina, for instance. So where custody lies of assets also can make a difference in what we're trying to protect, but ultimately it comes down to data and assets, and these two things can be spread across many different fronts that we deal with. There can be, our physical office and the network in the physical office where this information's passing. There's our custodians and the brokers. Maybe we have a fixed protocol going to a custodian. Maybe we're just interacting with Charles Schwab through a HTTP web browser session. Whatever the case may be, there's that connection to the actual custodians. Some firms have MSPs, the managed service providers. These are outside firms that come in and manage IT services. So we'll cover a little bit about them today and how they typically respond to these situations. And then, of course, from work from home, post-COVID, we now have the work from home environment that we're having to deal with and make sure is secure. And really within these environments, we're dealing with three kinds of threats. Your employees are by far your biggest threat, whether they're malicious or negligent. This is going to be your biggest threat to the security of your network. We also have random attacks and direct attacks, and we've covered these in more details in other webinars. But some firms, come up in random attacks, and others are direct attack. And within those two channels, we typically see state-sponsored hackers and ATP groups, which I'll make a nod to here in a little bit. Other criminal organizations and hacktivists that generally go through these two different channels. So when we look at the scope of attacks, it's best to understand how these attacks happen so that we really know what we need to protect against. So on the left, we can see a graph. So when we took a sample, and this was someone else's data, I believe this was CISA's data actually, but when they take a sample of attacks out there, these are the different vulnerabilities or attack channels that were used in those attacks. So 71% of all attacks analyzed had some phishing element. 50% of all attacks had an unpatched vulnerability that was taken advantage of. And ultimately, when we think about the firm, again, we're thinking about money, information, and assets. Surrounding that, we have communications protocols that we use, email, things like that. There's software and there's hardware. There's physical security, there's personal security, and there's organizational security. But still, unfortunately, sometimes these get penetrated and we have to respond, which is what we're going to talk about today. But again, the idea here is just understanding that phishing of your employees is a huge avenue of attack. And when we do our webinars where we demonstrate attacks and show what it looks like from a hacker's perspective, phishing is almost always a part of it. Unless we can find an unpatched vulnerability, so it's always, trying to figure out where to get in, and you want to be as hands-off as possible. Sometimes phishing is it, sometimes you can find an unpatched vulnerability, but generally that's what we see in the attacks, and that's what we're trying to protect against. And what's the outcome, right? Like, what's the worst thing that can happen? And I always describe to my clients and say, think about if you're sitting at your computer, there's a good chance if you're at a Windows computer, you could possibly click on a folder and have access to all of the firm's information, wherever you store that sensitive data. And so, what happens if you accidentally opening a phishing email and now your computer's been compromised and that folder and all that data has been compromised? Vice Society is one such group that goes out and does just that. This is actually a screenshot off of a dark web website where they essentially ransomware groups. On the right here, you can see a particular college that was under ransomware. Down below it, these are direct screenshots from the website. You can see the students' passports. I mean, literally any information that was when this university is now public out there for the searching. And ultimately, this is what we're trying to prevent, right? Like, we don't want this type of situation where, we have a client end up on Vice Society that says, ABC Wealth Management and all the documents that they have with their clients. So ultimately, that's what we're trying to prepare for, or prepare against and prevent. So the attack game plan. We used to say, hey, there are kind of 4 stages of this. One, preparing, making sure that we're doing everything we need to beforehand. There was a triage stage, after an attack happens, understanding what happened, what do we need to disconnect, then going into containment, making sure it doesn't spread, and then remediating, of course, getting everything back to a standard. And now we're looking at a potential step 5, which is reporting to the SEC on that Form ADV-C per the 20649 regulation. So, that's the game plan we're going to talk about today in these 5 areas, mostly focusing on the preparation. I think this is where a lot of firms really need to pay the most amount of attention, because if you do the work beforehand, the likelihood that you have to go through these additional steps is a lot less likely. So we'll spend a lot of time talking about preparing today. So how do you prepare? What does that mean? In some ways, doing this webinar is a little hard. It's almost like a CPA coming on and trying to give advice on how you file your taxes and what credits you should take and deductions and things like that, because it's so different for every firm. Every firm has a unique mix of email and website host and servers and cloud storage that they're using. So every firm's a little bit different. I think there's a kind of a few large overview points that everyone needs to know and everyone needs to understand. For one, just having a written response plan, one that outlines the steps that are going to take if you have an attack. And in that report, you have to name names. You have to say who's in charge of your cybersecurity. Who's going to report, who's going to run the operations, actually point fingers to these people. You need to be monitoring your networks, monitoring your databases and systems on a regular basis. So what does that mean? Again, that can be very different for most firms. My particular workflow, especially when I was in the CCO role, was one, having an email service provider where I could quickly pull login records and see where they were coming from. Were there any new IP addresses? I would simply pull those, put them into an Excel spreadsheet. This was 10 years ago. I know there's fancier things out there, but fancy isn't always the best way. Just pull those logs into an ongoing Excel spreadsheet and have it highlight if you have any new IP addresses connecting to your email, or if you have IP addresses that are consistently doing incorrect logins for your email or your website or your cloud storage or whatever the case may be. You need to be doing something to monitor your networks. And training employees, so we'll actually have some more data here to add soon, but if in that ongoing repository of items that we see the SEC request, I think on every one of them has been evidence of training employees on cybersecurity best practices. So, that's big. I know a lot of executives that are in these firms, a lot of them are somewhat tech savvy and they understand cybersecurity best practices, but I promise you, you have some employees that don't. So putting them through some kind of training goes a long way in preventing these attacks. Secure passwords stored and have accountability over them. I know LastPass had a lot of negative news lately about their breach. I personally loved LastPass because as the CCO, it gave me the ability to have oversight and accountability for all my employees' passwords to make sure they were in there, used securely, and having two-factor authentication in place, which is another one. I don't think there's any good reason for any service today that contains personally identifiable information not to have two-factor authentication available. And I also think there's no excuse for advisors and advisory firms not to be enforcing two-factor authentication everywhere. Like, this should no longer be an option. It should be the default. And if the software doesn't have two-factor authentication, you have to walk away from it. Two-factor authentication solves 99.9% of all cybersecurity problems. And without that, these systems are just a no-go these days, in my opinion. Firms need to be running vulnerability scans, whether you do that internal or have your MSP run them, which is doubtful they're going to do. That's essentially like producing their own report card and telling on where they cut corners. Perhaps they will, or hiring an auditing firm to go in and do it. Two, I think gathering intelligence on threat actors. So we've covered this in detail in other webinars and how to do that. So one of the things the SEC is going to ask for when they do an examination is a written cybersecurity, I've seen it called a couple different things, a cybersecurity risk assessment, a cybersecurity risk and threat assessment, or a cybersecurity threat assessment. Either one of these things, we need to have something where we are proactively taking a look at what our firm is putting out there into the world that could potentially be used by an attacker, to launch an attack against us. So, things like what lost passwords have been lost in breaches? Do you have metadata in the documents that you have on your website that reveal sensitive information? All these little things are the stuff that we like to check. And the last one is just doing some vendor due diligence. And again, this is just a hot topic because it's hard to do. It's hard to get something comprehensive. But from the get-go, when you're looking at these services, just look for some of those keywords. PCI DSS compliance, HIPAA compliance, SOC 2, ISO, et cetera, et cetera. There's so many of them out there. But look for something, at least at a starting point, and verifying these services that you're using. And if you in the other videos, it's when we do the cybersecurity policies and procedures manual, when you have these services that are already like that, it's super easy to pull that information about their cybersecurity compliance issues and what you're doing on vendor due diligence. So just from the get-go, look for firms that have those type of compliance. It'll make your compliance much easier. The other one's monitor the news, right? This is a big one I'm dealing with right now. It just hit the news a couple days ago, APT 28. APT stands for Advanced Persistent Threat. And this is a release from CISA and the FBI and the NSA. Essentially, Russia has been compromising Cisco routers through a pretty common port. So I can tell you just about every audit I've done, I've seen this port open. So now these firms are going to have to go back and do specific analysis on this from this type of alert. So always monitor the news. CISA, the CISA, they have a great, no spammy, no nonsense letter that you can sign up for. Comes out once a week, says, hey, these are all the new known vulnerabilities. It literally takes 10 seconds to run through that list and see if you recognize any systems that you have on there. And in some of our other webinars, we talk about network mapping, and we'll talk just slightly about it here in a minute. But when you have those network maps, it's really easy to monitor the news and go in and check and see what systems you might have that could be exploited by this. So monitoring the news is a big one. Just see what's going on. And again, training is extremely important. If you haven't done any, we have a product called Fieldcraft where we actually offer it for free for firms with less than 10 people. So that's a great option if you've never done any training. Super easy to get through. We use live actors and somewhat humorous videos to help kind of get your employees through it without too much pain. But that's a great option if you've never done any training. All right, so let's talk about what do we do after it happens, right? We've done everything that we can to prepare. We've done our vulnerability scans. We've trained our employees, and we've yet still had an employee, come under attack from phishing. So, let's talk about what to do after it happens. I like to just combine triage and containment here because in reality, when you're doing these things, they go hand in hand. The number one step, and we're gonna repeat this throughout, is contact an attorney. Okay, you're gonna start getting asked a lot of questions by some authorities. You definitely want to have an attorney involved. Make an effort to identify the affected systems and make an immediate effort to contain that breach. If you had an employee just click on a PDF and they know that was a malicious PDF, shut down that computer, unplug it from the network, get it off, get it containerized so that we can figure out what happened. Conduct a thorough investigation, try to understand their entry point. If you've done your preparations and you've done your risk assessment, you're going to have a pretty good understanding of their entry points and where they may have come in. So try to identify how long they were present, what data have been exposed. At this time, you're going to want to notify your internal stakeholders. So if you're the IT guy or you're the CCO and you found out about this, now's the time to bring in those individuals that are named as cybersecurity managers on your policies and procedures manual. Again, you have to have those people named. This is when you're going to bring them involved. We do not want to notify the clients at this point. We're not there yet. We don't have clarity. We're not going to understand what happened. So we definitely do not want to notify the clients at this point. Still, if this is beyond the knowledge of a lot of firms, which it is, it's beyond the knowledge of this firm. We don't do this type of work. You want to have a forensic analyst in there to assess the damage, look at the networks, and understand what that remediation process is going to look like for you guys. And again, this is where being prepared comes in. Here's a quick snapshot of the type of network maps we build for our clients. We understand everything that's on that network, what systems are on there. So then in event of an attack, it's really easy to pull this up and go, okay, John's computer here was compromised. He clicked on a PDF. Now we know all the systems that were running and where that attacker may pivoted from that individual node on the network. So having that map definitely comes in handy. Reason, and to this kind of the same point, the faster you act to contain, the better, right? So I think this is a point that a lot of firms and a lot of individuals don't understand about an attack and how it goes down in real life. So everyone was pretty familiar with the Equifax breach. This wasn't just a one violation of password and, they were in. This pivoted between many different points. So on the left here, you can see different attack vectors, and over on top, you can see the different assets that contained sensitive information. So their first step was to find an unpatched vulnerability in a server, right? We talked about that a minute ago in the type of threats that we see coming in the attacks. Once they got into the server with an unpatched vulnerability, they found a misconfiguration in a data storage unit. And from there, they were able to find some shared passwords from Microsoft Active Directory. They were able to steal some certificates. And at that point, they had customer data lost through a couple of different applications and databases. So had there been some measurement in place to quickly identify an attack here on the server, perhaps step 2 could have been prevented, right? Had this been completely disconnected from the network, they're not going to pivot through. So the faster you can contain it, the better you are. when I do audits, I'm authorized to be there. So we're shooting packets all over the network. We're being extremely loud because I have a certain time frame that I have to get this work done in. A real world attack does not go down like that. If I'm attacking a firm in the real world and I have malicious intent and I find an unpatched vulnerability, I'm going to get in that server and I'm going to chill out for a few minutes, right, and watch what's going on. If I'm really wanting to get in, I don't want to make waves. I want to be silent. I want to be quiet and understand the network I'm watching in. So again, in the real world, you have time. If you can prepare and understand the attack when it happens, it's easier to disconnect this and save. Okay, so just, overall there, understand it is a process. It's not once you've clicked a phishing email, it's over with. Once you realize it, immediately disconnect your computer and you have a really high chance that you've probably saved further contamination of the network. Let's talk about the most important rule that no IT firm is ever going to tell you. The FBI may want to have a word with you, okay? And you do not talk to law enforcement without an attorney, right? That's the one thing every judge, every lawyer, every cop, every FBI agent in the nation teaches their kids. You never talk to law enforcement. They are not your friends. The FBI is not in your office to gather your statement and your evidence to put together a SWAT team and go after whoever violated your network. They are there to collect evidence in case the government wants to sue you or your clients want to sue you. If you're a CISO, your employer may want to sue you. So never talk to the FBI without having an attorney present. Anything you say to them will be used against you. It's guaranteed. So that is one thing I think that IT firms never really have an honest conversation with about their clients. The SEC is a little bit different. You're going to have to talk to the SEC. Again, you're going to want to have an attorney present when you talk to them. You don't want to incriminate yourself. You don't want to say anything like, well, Bob forgot to patch a computer or anything like that. So I think a lot of clients have been brought up that, you talk to the police and that sort of thing, and they worry that if they don't talk to the police are going to think they're guilty. And that is not the case at all. They are professional. They understand the rules. They know what they're going by. They know that anyone who is also professional is not going to talk to them without an attorney. So if there's one thing that I want my firms and my clients to take away from this, if you do have a breach, get an attorney. The FBI may want to have a talk. You're going to want them present. Okay, now we're on to remediation steps, right? We understand the damage, what's been done. In terms of SEC compliance, we're going to want to show written documentation of everything that was touched, where it went, and we want to prioritize the damage. Within that report, we also want to talk about our remediation steps. What did we do? Okay, Bob's computer was phished. Bob quickly realized he had a phishing email. We disconnected the computer. We brought in a forensic analyst who monitored the network for 2 weeks and never found any malicious activity. We wiped Bob's hard drive, backed up everything from storage, and Bob was back to work the next Monday, right? So we want to document all that as much as we can and put it into writing. Of course, with the idea of trying to maintain continuity as much as possible within the network. That's one thing the SEC is really going to look at when they're looking at these reports is, were you able to maintain continuity and not skip a beat, okay? We touched on it a second ago, but monitoring all networks and systems for suspicious activity. So, even once we've wiped Bob's laptop and plugged it back in, we still want to monitor the network, whether that's using a program like Wireshark or Suricata or whoever might be doing this activity. We'll definitely want to monitor it and print reports to show that suspicious activity is gone. And then, of course, once this is done, let's go back and review our policies and procedures manual and update it as needed. So let's talk about how we're pulling logs, how we're pulling records, who's responsible for it, and things like that, and make sure we have accurate representation of it in our policies and procedures documentation. So this is going to be a new one, right? So reporting to the SEC under 20649, and this is going to be on the Form ADV-C. We're also going to be required to start disclosing past incidences on the form ADV Part 2A, so the written description. I believe I have that correctly. I believe it's on 2A, but we're going to have to disclose to clients any past incidences we've had or anything that we've reported to the form ADV-C. So the form, as 20649 says, the form ADV-C is going to have to be filed within 48 hours. That is an insane timeline. That's not going to happen. So that was brought up in a lot of the comment period with the SEC under 20649. The SEC basically came back and said, no problem. Just make sure you file something within the 48 hours and then update it as frequently as needed. So they're still sticking by their 48 hours. If you followed what we've been talking about, 20649 isn't in its final stages yet, and this may be one thing that changes. I can just tell you 48 hours is a very unrealistic timeline for a firm to understand that attack happened, to pull in outside help, and to analyze the attack and have a good understanding what, if anything, was actually compromised, right? In my mind, that's the worst, that we file form ADV-C and say, you know, hey, Bob clicked on a phishing link, you know, Bob had full access to client records on his computer, and then it turns out that wasn't accurate. And we go back and say, oh yeah, you know, actually we don't really know what we're doing, and we filed it by mistake. So a lot of issues with that 48-hour rule, and it'll be interesting to see if it comes out in the final regulation. And, you know, and if it does, you know, how frequently are updates to be expected? You know, so maybe frequently, because this form is going to be filed through the IARD electronically, so should be easy to do. But of course, like everything, make sure you have your attorney read over that before we possibly disclose incriminating information to the SEC about our operations. So as it stands right now, that form is going to be a combination of checklist and short answer. It's the form ADV-C I'm talking about. I apologize, I should have had that at the top there. But they're basically looking for a description of the incident, its impacts, and what efforts were taken to contain it. They want to know whether confidential customer data was stolen or otherwise accessed or exfiltrated. And of course, with that comes that documentation that we talked about, right? We can't just say, yeah, no, it didn't happen. We have to have pretty solid documentation behind that. And of course, whether customer funds were transferred without proper authorization. This generally isn't much of an issue, especially for a lot of the clients I work with that don't have custody. It has become issues with certain funds, even when they have custodians, when perhaps a trader's computer was overtaken, which had direct access to trading, and maybe some malicious trades went off. So we've seen a little bit of that, but generally not full out customer fund transfers to unauthorized third parties. And of course, they want to know about any corrective actions that you've taken to mitigate the effects of it. And of course, any related litigation, regulatory proceedings, or law enforcement investigations. So if you have any of those going on, those will need to be disclosed to the SEC on that form ADV there. All right, so in summary, it's pretty simple, right? Don't get hacked, don't talk to the police, and start saving for an attorney, because it's going to get expensive if it happens. You know, all that's to say, hey, you really have to make sure you prepare. You know, I know this was kind of a broad webinar, and you know, we're not really talking about a lot of the specifics about, okay, well, how do you run Wireshark to monitor a network, or Suricata, or anything of that nature, and maybe we can get in that to a webinar one day if we have enough people interested in that technical side of it. I'm certainly happy to have that conversation. But just the idea here, you know, I think every firm needs to have a game plan for what's going to happen if you get hacked, right? We see it. We see it a lot. And what we don't see a lot is the firms that get hacked and don't even know it, right? And I think a lot of firms could be in that shoe if they sit back and say, well, hey, what are we doing to actually monitor our network? And if you can't think of anything, well, how do you know if you've been hacked, right? Like, how do you know if any of your computers have been compromised? You know, when we look at the APT compromise of the router, you know, it's basically an open SNMP port coming out, which looks very ordinary, right? Like, this is not something that arouses suspicion for a lot of them. So, you know, little things have to be investigated in networks. And I think that's especially true the larger a firm gets that they have to deal with. So any questions, I'm certainly happy to take them now. If you have them, you can put them in the Q&A forum. Or if you have any questions about your specific firm, you're certainly welcome to reach out to me either through email or phone. Definitely happy to chat. I'm going to make a recording of this webinar, pass it around. Usually takes me about 24 hours or so to get it around. So if you need to pass it around or catch it up, you should get it fairly shortly. And then, of course, I'll also post it to our YouTube channel where I post all the other webinars that I've recorded on there in the past. So if you want to check out one that I've referenced, sometime in this video, you'll be able to find it there on the YouTube channel. So certainly appreciate everyone coming in. It's always great to be able to chat with everyone and get a good turnout. And if you have anything that you can add to this, I see there's definitely a couple attorneys here in the audience. So as always, if there's anything you can add to the conversation, please reach out to me. Let me know. I'll round up with everyone else, kind of let them know what you're seeing as well. But I really do appreciate everyone's time. Hope you have a great rest of your day and upcoming weekend.